Welcome back. For those of you who are new, my name is James and I run the Al-Maida Initiative. For the last 10 years, I've been getting Christians and Muslims together over food for friendly and honest conversation. I'm currently comparing Muslims to 3 biblical archetypes as a way of helping Christians think through how they interact with Muslims. For the first week, we talked about the Samaritans as the placeholder for the kind of average Muslim. Last week, we talked about the Pharisees, the sort of religious zealot archetype. And today, we're going to talk about archetype number 3, the Romans. That might seem like the strangest comparison at face value, but the most important thing to understand is at the time of Jesus, the Jews and Christians were both at the mercy of a government with a different religious system, which tolerated them sometimes and persecuted them at other times. If you're interacting with Muslims in the West, you'll meet both zealous Muslims and those who don't really practice, and this is just as true if you live in a Muslim country. However, for the millions of Christians who live under Muslim governments, it is necessary for us to talk about what it means to live under a government that may view your beliefs as a threat to social order. The Roman Empire was not a monolith. Some emperors persecuted Christians, some left them alone, some officials were corrupt and incompetent, others were highly honorable and upheld the law without corruption. This has been equally true throughout Muslim history. Different rulers have treated Christians very differently. Omar, the second caliph, had all the Christians of Najran and Arabia deported, while Muawiyah, the fifth caliph, was very religiously tolerant, even having a Christian as the highest government official under him. If you look at Christian discourse today, many see political Islam as the arch-enemy of Christian civilization, and a unique threat to Christianity that must be put in a category all by itself, since it turns Christians into dhimmis, essentially second-class citizens. And while hardcore Islam may have persecuted Christians at a scale that was unique, the spirit of this persecution was very much shared by the Roman Empire. In fact, I would argue that the Roman Empire edges out the Muslims as it actually oversaw the unjust execution of Jesus himself, and no one will ever be able to replicate that specific act of malice. No one can top that level of evil. They took the prize. Persecution of Christians is not a Muslim invention. It's something Jesus himself told us to expect from the get-go. That first came from some Jews, then it came from the Romans. In fact, when Mehmet the Conqueror took over Constantinople, he declared himself Kaiser-i Rumi, the Caesar of the Romans. So how did Jesus deal with Rome? The easiest place to look at this is in Jesus' direct interaction with Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, and we have many more examples throughout the lives of Jesus' apostles who he trained through the book of Acts. One of the key things we see from Jesus is there's no inherent clash between the spread of Christianity and human governments. In John 18:36, Jesus famously said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." This doesn't mean that Christianity has nothing to say to the government about what justice is, or which laws should or should not be enforced. But we have an inbuilt disposition to honor the place of government and to defer to the government unless it would cause us to sin. The teaching of Jesus flows from the Old Testament teaching that recognized that God is the sovereign over the rise and fall of every nation, as seen in Daniel 4:35, and that every human government, in some sense, is part of a divine order. Note what Jesus says to Pilate: "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above." Meaning, the Roman Empire was there because God had put the Roman Empire there. This did not mean the Roman Empire was righteous or even good, but that it was a tool in the hand of God. It was God's will that the Romans would arise. It was God's will that they would fall. It was God's will that the Islamic Caliphate displaced half of Christendom, and it's the will of God that it was destroyed by the Mongols. It was God's will when Constantinople fell to Mehmet II, and it was God's will when Ottoman power was smashed at the siege of Vienna. This means, as Christians, we can have inner peace no matter which government we live under, knowing that God is sovereign. We can obey any government up to a point and pay taxes, and our taxes do not make us guilty of the crimes of our government. Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." The Apostle Paul would also write about the same topic, and everything he says is downstream from what Jesus himself taught. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. Respect to whom respect is owed. Honor to whom honor is owed. Keep in mind, this was not written in the context of some idyllic Christian state, but in the context of the Roman Empire, making the case that even they were unwitting servants of God. Proverbs 21 verse 1 says, "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will." Therefore, this also applies to Muslim governments, who despite not knowing God, function to some capacity as his servants. This means, on a basic level, Christians in Muslim countries should respect their governments, pay taxes to their governments, and obey them in any way that doesn't mean breaking the direct commands of God. Reading the Bible should also humanize government officials, not seeing them as blind instruments, but image bearers of God and sinners just like the rest of us. If you read the book of Acts, you will see that early Christianity was not hiding from the government, but knocking on its front door. After all, the climax of the book of Acts is pointing towards the truth being proclaimed in the very heart of Rome when an angel of God told Paul, "Do not be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar." In Acts 13:6, Paul shares the gospel with Sergius Paulus, the proconsul of Crete, who becomes a Christian. In Acts 16:35, Paul was in Philippi. He was beaten and unlawfully thrown in jail by the local Roman government, and used his rights as a Roman citizen against the city magistrates to make them come and apologize to him. In Acts 18:12, a Jewish mob in Achaia drags Paul before the Roman proconsul Gallio, who's portrayed as a strong leader who refuses to get involved in a debate about theology which doesn't impact Roman law, giving protection to Paul and the Christians without even being asked. In Acts 22:25, Paul saves himself from flogging at the last possible second by means of his citizenship. And in the next few chapters, Claudius Lysias, the Roman centurion, is presented by the narrative as a just, law-abiding man who takes his job seriously, properly investigating the situation and giving Paul proper protection. The next government official we meet in Acts is the governor Felix in chapter 24, who's portrayed as an intelligent, curious, benevolent, and slightly corrupt man. He is described as having accurate knowledge of Christianity. He makes sure that Paul has some liberty in his captivity, and his friends are able to visit. He also enjoys reasoning with Paul and talking to him, but never ultimately changes his mind as he's waiting for a bribe that never arrives. Ultimately, Felix doesn't cause any major damage, nor does he really get anything done, as is true with many Muslim and non-Muslim politicians. Felix is then replaced by Festus as governor in Acts 26. Felix accuses Paul of being mad after hearing him share the gospel, but ultimately still does his job, follows the law, and ensures that Paul is sent to Caesar for his trial. The elephant in the room here is that Paul was, of course, later executed at the orders of Emperor Nero, as the young emperor slipped further and further into madness. So what do we do with all this information? Well, the Muslim world, like the Roman world, is full of different kinds of leaders. Some are fair-minded, some who strenuously uphold the rule of law, others who are generally benevolent but hoping for bribes, and then you have leaders who are zealous persecutors of Christians. When the Taliban took over Afghanistan, I became friends with many Afghan Christians who, under the semi-secular government of Ashraf Ghani, had gained the ability to change the religion on their national ID card from Muslim to other, which ended up being really bad timing when the Ghani government was chased out of Afghanistan by the Taliban. The Taliban are an extremist variant of the Deobandi school of thought, a movement which has many parallels to the Salafi movement in the Arab world, but with some theological differences. My friends would have been executed as apostates by the Taliban, but through a string of divine providence, they were evacuated to the United Arab Emirates, which is another Muslim country. In Abu Dhabi, they were housed and fed for more than a year at the expense of the Emirati government, which some might argue was done as a favor to the US. But while my friends were confined to a refugee camp, as they didn't have proper documentation to leave, some Emirati officials took pity on my friends and organized outings into Abu Dhabi to make their lives less monotonous. This all happened with the Emiratis knowing my friends were ex-Muslim Christians. Then when the Afghan refugees finally got permission to move to America or Canada, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the president of the UAE, personally donated $1,500 in cash to each Afghan. Whether or not a Christian living in a Muslim country faces persecution from the government depends entirely when and where they live. Christians in Afghanistan are still running for their lives, being arrested or imprisoned by the Taliban. Whereas in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, churches are open and Christians who used to be Muslims are protected and given refuge. In Saudi Arabia, Christianity's public expression is still illegal, but the government of Saudi is not actively persecuting Saudi Christians and generally leaves them alone. The Saudi government doesn't ask, the Saudi Christians don't tell. So as Christians, we shouldn't view Muslim governments as our inevitable enemies. We should understand that some government officials will oppose the gospel and persecute Christians, but others might become our friends, or at least just a neutral arbiters who will uphold the rights of Christians. If Christians assume every single government official is going to be our enemy, then it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It becomes a cat and mouse game. Christians constantly trying to hide from the government and the government constantly trying to figure out what is going on. To be clear, some people should be hiding and need to exercise caution. But the book of Acts paints a clear example of Christians who knock on the front door of the government, who talk to the government, and ultimately speak the truth of Jesus to government officials. Not everyone needs to go for this Leroy Jenkins charge straight into the fray approach, but somebody does. Perhaps that's you. Maybe through your boldness, your friendship, and your reasonableness, God will open up a door with a Muslim government that will open the way for Christians to live more freely, to speak more clearly, and to stop living in fear of an unpredictable system. Speaking of governments, come back next week and I'm going to talk about how bad theology ruined the First Crusade.